The blockade is not the real weapon here. The real weapon is the moment a Chinese flagged ship keeps moving and the United States does nothing. That is when the whole performance risks collapsing. Because this story is not only about Iran, it is about enforceability. It is about whether America can turn announcement into obedience when the actors that matter most have already started calculating around the announcement. That is why I think this blockade is better understood, not as a strategy to win, but as a bluff that several different powers are uniquely positioned to puncture. And once that bluff is punctured, everything changes. The source lays out the sequence with brutal clarity: 21 hours of talks in Islamabad. No deal. Trump then announces a blockade on the very strait he has spent weeks demanding be reopened. That alone is already an admission of failure. The same source says Trump called it complete while Suncom described something narrower, meaning the policy is internally contradictory before the first ship is even challenged. Fei file aside, Fei turn 6, file 3. Fei turn 6, file 1, Fei, that is always how weak coercion begins. Big language first, operational confusion underneath. And when operational confusion sits under maritime coercion, the first serious test can turn the whole thing into a public lesson in limits. That is where China comes in. I do not think enough people understand how important the China angle is to this story. It is not simply that China buys energy and has relations with Iran. It is that China, according to the source, is already behaving like a power willing to challenge the American framing directly. Chinese ships keep moving. Chinese payments run in yuan. Chinese officials warn outside powers not to interfere. The source translates that into plain language. Our ships are going through, try to stop us. Fei file a site, Fei turn 6, file 4, Fei. That matters because blockades live or die on belief. Not belief in your naval tonnage alone. Belief that you will actually enforce what you declare. Belief that others will back down before you have to choose. Belief that the first test ship will stop. But what if it does not? That is the central problem. If a Chinese linked tanker approaches and the United States stops it, the crisis escalates toward major power confrontation. If the United States attacks it, the crisis explodes. If the United States lets it through, then the blockade has taught every shipping actor in the world the same lesson. Reflag, reroute politically, and dare Washington to escalate beyond its own appetite. That is the logic bomb embedded inside this policy. Its first serious test may also be its first major humiliation. And humiliation is contagious. Because once one actor learns the line is soft, others start probing. Then the blockade becomes selective, then selective becomes porous, then porous becomes symbolic, and then the only thing left is the cost Washington imposed on itself while failing to create actual obedience. That cost is already visible. In the source, oil above 104 warnings of supply loss, consumer confidence collapsing. All of that before enforcement even becomes real. Fei site Fei turn 6, file 4 Fei. That is why the most important insight in the source is not simply that the blockade hurts America. It is that America is uniquely vulnerable to the political speed of energy pain. Iran can absorb pressure over long horizons. The American political system hates near. Term household pain, gas prices move faster than doctrine, freight costs move faster than White House messaging. Fear at the pump moves faster than any speech about strength. And if this blockade is challenged while prices are already biting, the domestic space around it gets tighter fast. That is exactly the kind of environment in which bluffs die. Not because the Navy disappears, because the political room to use the Navy as threatened disappears. And here's where the second board becomes so important. The source argues that Iran is not playing on one board only. Hormuz is one board, the Red Sea is another. If Iran's aligned actors can widen commercial pain through Bab el Mandeb while America focuses on Hormuz, then Washington is intensifying a leverage contest where the opposing side may be able to answer on a second axis. Fei file a site, Fei turn 6, file 2 Fei, that is a horrifying asymmetry. Because it means America is choosing a tactic that intensifies the exact kind of contest its domestic system is least built to sustain. Every extra week of disruption increases the odds that Washington starts looking for rhetorical off-ramps rather than strategic ones. Every extra sign that global shipping can route politically around the blockade weakens deterrence. Every extra sign that allied governments are not truly on board makes enforcement look more unilateral and more exposed. That is why I think the blockade should be read as a bluff nested inside a trap. The bluff is that the United States can fully enforce what it announced against all meaningful challengers. The trap is that proving it can do so may carry costs it will not actually pay. That is a very bad place for a superpower to be, because credibility is easiest to lose precisely when you try to display it through an action that creates too many losing choices. Now add Russia. If Hormuz tightens, Russian oil becomes more profitable. If war premiums rise, Moscow benefits. If the United States carries out a policy that scares energy markets while claiming to stabilize them, then Moscow gets one of the oldest gifts in geopolitics: an adversary financing the favorable price conditions of your commodity power. The source is explicit that the blockade would make Russia richer, fei file site fei turn 6 file 2 fei. That is why the source is so angry. It sees the American president not just failing to weaken Iran, but helping generate the conditions under which Russia earns more. China gets the test resolve, and Iran gets to prove that the artery cannot be disciplined on Washington. S terms, that is a staggering alignment of bad outcomes. And it all comes back to one thing: the negotiation failed, and the response to that failure was emotional rather than structural. Bad imperial decisions are often made in the gap between humiliation and reflection. If reflection comes first, strategy can still recover. If humiliation comes first and reflection never arrives, the state starts lashing out in ways that advertise injury more than strength. The blockade, in this source, looks exactly like that kind of injury reaction. It is not the sequel to a successful diplomatic shaping effort. It is the sequel to visible rejection, fei file site fei turn 6 file 3, fei turn 6 file 2 fei, that is catastrophic in maritime crisis management. Because maritime crisis management is unforgiving: one vessel, one flag, one boarding decision, one refusal. Any one of those moments can turn the whole bluff into a lesson about limits. And if that lesson arrives through China, the consequences echo far beyond Hormuz. That is the other frightening point in the source precedent. If the United States normalizes the idea that a major naval actor can blockade a globally vital strait under a self-justifying security logic, then Beijing learns something useful for a future Taiwan crisis. Not because the cases are identical, because great powers study language, habit, precedent. And tolerated behavior, a bad precedent today, becomes an enemy argument tomorrow. The source says that directly: fei file site fei turn 6 file 4 fei. That is how short-term improvisation becomes long-term strategic debt. So what happens next? I do not think the first collapse of this blockade, if collapse is the right word, will look like a surrender speech. It will look smaller: a ship goes through, then another, then Washington decides not to test a certain flag, then insurers and traders adjust, then governments start calculating that the line is political, not absolute. Then the blockade quietly transforms from an act of control into an act of selective harassment. At that point, the original announcement is dead, even if nobody officially buries it. And then the White House will need a new story. That is usually how these things go. Victory language, quiet erosion, a face-saving reformulation. Maybe the blockade was always narrower than people thought. Maybe it succeeded by sending a message. Maybe it opened diplomatic space. That is how failed coercion gets rewritten after the fact. But the market, the ship owners, the states, and the adversaries, remember the real lesson. The real lesson is whether the line held when a powerful actor crossed it. That is why I think the Chinese flag vessel scenario matters, even if it arrives in a slightly different form. It identifies the stress point. It identifies the exact place where announcement and enforcement can separate in public view. Once that difference is seen, the rest of the structure often unravels quickly. So here's my final judgment. Trump's Hormuz blockade is not just a self-goal because it raises prices, isolates America, and strengthens rivals. It is a self-goal because it creates a public test the United States may not want to pass the way it originally threatened to. If the line is enforced hard, the escalation risk is enormous. If the line is not enforced hard, the credibility loss is enormous. That is the signature of badly designed coercion. You do not produce dominance. You produce a dilemma in which every visible choice weakens the very thing you were trying to display. And in that sense, the blockade is not really about closing the strait at all. It is about forcing America to prove it can control the consequences of its own announcement. I do not think it can. Not against China. Not against an adversary that can widen the pain through other choke points. Not while allies are drifting. Not while Russia profits. Not while the domestic cost meter starts running before the first victory can even be claimed. That is why the most dangerous part of this whole episode is not what Iran might do next. It is the possibility that the world is about to watch a superpower discover in real time that bluffing at the center of global energy flows is much easier than making the bluff stick.